This is our 2024 CDBG implementation training. Welcome. The purpose of today's CDBG implementation training is to provide you with an introductory overview of the requirements for administering community development block grants for our various programs. Our primary focus will be administering the public facilities and planning program projects, but the basic level requirements that we'll cover today will apply to some degree to each of the CDBG programs, and we'll highlight the differences that apply to various programs such as CV, DR, ED, PFED, and PS program projects. This training event will also provide us with an opportunity to introduce you to our Bureau of Community Development staff members. We'll begin by introducing ourselves. I am Sally Smarzinski. I'm serving as one of the two primary presenters for today's training. I'm a grant specialist advanced with the Bureau of Community Development, and I've spent the last 2 years managing projects for the CDBG program. And now I'll turn it over to Jo so she can introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanna Storm. I am, like Sally, a grant specialist advance with our Bureau of Community Development, and I'll be celebrating 11 years with our Bureau of Community Development at the beginning of October. I'm very excited to work with all of you and to see all of you in attendance today.
In the next 2.5 hours, we'll cover the immediate next steps to getting started on your CDBG projects. We will walk through an example timeline for a PF project and highlight key deadlines and due dates. We will review the requirements for procurement, bidding and contracting, acquisition, labor standards, and monitoring activities. We will highlight key elements to maintain compliance with the CDBG program. We'll also list some best practices and provide additional resources that you can access. We will take a brief 10-minute break approximately halfway through today's presentation, and we'll allow for questions at the end as we close out our presentation. During today's training, we ask that you mute your microphone and please turn off your camera to minimize the used bandwidth. If the session appears to freeze up or you lose audio or visual, please try logging off and logging back in. To minimize interruptions, we ask that you submit any questions utilizing the chat feature during the presentation. We do have staff monitoring this to provide responses. We may pause throughout the training to address these questions for the entire group. Otherwise, we'll recap at the end of the presentation. You may also raise your hand during the dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. As we proceed through today's training, you may wish to have the following handouts readily available to reference. You can use the agenda to follow along during the training as we highlight key points. You can access the training slides we'll be using, and open the example grant agreement, specifically the attachments A through F portion, which details all the requirements we're covering today. As an additional option, if you've already received a draft or executed grant agreement, please have it handy during today's presentation and refer to it often. The CDBG implementation handbook linked here is posted online. This will be a highly used resource for managing your project. Additional topic-specific webinar sessions have been recorded and are posted on our website. We'll now turn the presentation over to our new Bureau Director, Tamara Fabian, to introduce herself. Go ahead, Tamara.
Thanks, Sally. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 CDBG implementation training. I am Tamara Fabian, as Sally stated, the new Bureau Director. I've been with the Bureau for about 6 years now, but I do have approximately 24 years of experience working with our CDBG program. I and everyone here at the Bureau look forward to working with you and your community on your project. And I'll now turn it over to Angela.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Angela. I am the section chief for the Bureau of Community Development. And like Joe, I celebrated my 11 years with the Bureau in July. So I'm pleased to welcome everyone and also congratulate you all on your award. Hopefully the training today will be helpful to you. I will also introduce our other staff in the sense of just naming them here. We have Casey Dobson, who mainly works with our housing programs, and also Amanda Canuck, who works with our CDBG and other programs, Samantha Larson, who also works with housing, and Ben Lehner, who primarily works with our CDBG programs. Sally and Joe already introduced themselves, but also we have Julie Speck, who many of you probably have already interacted with because she's our environmental compliance officer and also is a grant specialist that works with the CDBG programs. Next slide. So I am here not only to congratulate you all on your awards and say thank you for joining us for this training today and hoping that this is helpful to you, but also to share some reminders as you go through the training today to encourage you to pay attention to some important things related to grant compliance. We want you to be successful with your grants, and that's part of why we are offering this training today, but also why we have so many documents and so many manuals and handouts and things for you through the course of your project, all hopefully to help you with your project. We also, of course, have our Decker staff, our Division of Energy, Housing, and Community Resources staff, and they can assist you as well. So I encourage you to reach out to your assigned representative, and this would be the person who helped you with getting your grant agreement, your pre-agreement documents in, and also will be helping with the execution of your grant agreement. Some reminders I want to ensure that you are aware of, though, and you'll hear about these from Sally and Joe later today, are related to the engineering and environmental activities that you've already completed for those of you who are earlier grantees, and some of you are brand new as 2024 grantees, all of whom have done some engineering and environmental work. If there are any changes in your project, you may end up having to modify or update your environmental review. So we want to ensure to not go out of compliance by proceeding with activities that weren't originally included in your environmental review. So just be sure that you are reaching out to the environmental desk and your assigned project rep. Also, something that is very important that you should know is that the July 1st, 2025 deadline that we had in the application materials for the 2024 awardees is a firm deadline. You must have written approval from us for any delays, so you must contact us immediately. And note that your grant could be rescinded if you do not have approval for an extension to your construction deadline date. And we have been very strict with this deadline, mainly so that we can ensure that we're in compliance with HUD requirements. Also, the construction end date is October 31st, 2026 for those of you who were awarded in 2024. And I'm speaking to the Public Facilities Program awardees right now that were awarded in July. Also, the December 31st, 2026 performance period end date is firm. We are expecting you to complete your projects in a timely manner. That's why we originally had you work on your engineering and environmental prior to application. And it's really important for you to do this to ensure compliance. You should not rely on amendments to proceed with a project. We're very strict on our requirements. Next slide. Also, some important reminders, you're getting ready to do bidding. This will be talked about a little bit later, but I just want to emphasize that starting bidding early is really important to meet the construction start and end deadlines. So don't wait until March or April to do your bidding. You should be doing that immediately as soon as feasible to ensure that you're able to start construction on time, and anticipate needing extra time for rebidding. So first rounds may be difficult to obtain bids, or the bids end up being higher than expected. So you might have to make some changes or make some revisions to your plans. So anticipate this when you're scheduling your bidding. Also, to request a delay in the project's construction start date due to rebidding might not be approved by us if it was related to initially delaying bidding. So if you delayed bidding until next June and then come back to us and say that bidding wasn't successful, that would be something that we would have to consider because you've delayed the start of the bidding. You want to ensure that you're bidding in a timely manner. Also, something that was changed the last couple of years is that we do require that you bid an entire project. So not waiting to bid phase 2 and phase 3 of a project, because again, these can delay construction. So you must bid the entire project at the start. All components and phases must be bid at the same time. And again, no second bidding because these have tended to cause delays in projects, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. Next slide.
Angela, just one clarification.
Yep.
Could you specify bidding the entire project versus breaking up the project into multiple bids?
Yes, sure, Joe. So for what we're speaking of, it means bidding all at once, so that you can have separate bids for, say, your street work and a separate bid for the construction work of a building, and you could split those up into different bidding, but they all have to be in this at the same time in this current year. You can't wait until year 2 of the grant to bid components. So thank you for requesting that clarification. So you can have separate bidding activities, but they all have to be current and now. So additionally, related to your project administration, we just encourage you to carefully read and follow the project timeline and deliverables. And we know that the CDBG administration is labor intensive. So you'll need to allocate the necessary time to review your work before submitting it. Disbursements requests and other reporting is consistently rejected for program non-compliance. This is not a good reflection on the grantee nor the state, but also it can delay payments, and this really can impact a project. So grant administrators and others who are managing the project really need to pay attention and really read carefully through things. And again, Joe and Sally will be covering this more. I'm just here to really emphasize, listen when they're talking about them, because they're very important for you to maintain compliance. And non-compliance can result in funds being rescinded, whether that be an entire grant or a portion of the grant may be lost due to a non-compliance issue or delay issue. So we want to ensure that you are successful again, and we're providing this guidance and these reminders for that. So go ahead and go to the next slide, and I believe this is where Sally will be taking over again. But thank you all again, and congratulations again on your awards.
Thank you, Angela. Now we'll focus on the immediate next steps related to getting your project started. All 2024 CDBG PF awardees should have returned their signed award acceptance to Decker by now. If you've received a recent project award, please return the signed acceptance as soon as possible. You should also provide additional pre-agreement documentation to Decker. Refer to your award letter for more detail. Execute the grant agreement with DOA, and remain compliant with the grant agreement and our current program requirements as stated in our CDBG Implementation Handbook. The handbook chapters and the associated chapter attachments and forms are posted on our website. The UGLUG is responsible for ensuring the terms of the grant agreement are met. UGLUGs that contract with a third-party consultant to provide grant administrative services for their project will remain the responsible entity for compliance and held accountable for any non-compliance issues. Please note, non-compliance with program rules may result in cancellation of the grant, and/or the UGLUG may be required to pay back or return CDBG funds to the state. Be aware this has happened multiple times before. It is important to notify Decker as soon as possible if there are any updates pertaining to the project. Typical updates often include staffing changes as a result of local elections, promotions, retirements, or hiring grant admins and other support staff. Decker staff will communicate with the project's designated grant admin, whether municipal staff or a contracted third-party consultant, as the primary point of contact, and we will generally try to include the local clerk on email correspondence. If you have project-specific questions, please reach out to your assigned Decker program rep first. For more general questions or concerns, utilize the DOA CDBG at wisconsin.gov Bureau email address. Also, use email for all communications with Decker. You can scan signed paper documents for submission to staff. Keep your completed pre-agreement documentation with your local CDBG project files. Forms may need to be updated. Information such as staff changes and bank account information may change unexpectedly during the project. Make sure forms are updated and sent in to your project representative. Review your application carefully. The information previously presented and approved for the award must align with or support what's placed in your grant agreement. So double check the budget, the scope of work, and project beneficiaries for clarity. Regarding the HUD National Objective and project beneficiaries, significant unapproved changes to your project will invalidate your award, potentially triggering a loss of the CDBG funds. Do not attempt to change or combine the national objective associated with your grant award. As a reminder, several activities are prohibited in conjunction with using CDBG dollars. For additional information, please refer to the websites listed on the next slide. These additional websites can assist you in managing your project. Please make a note of them. A friendly reminder to be aware of the change in use restrictions for CDBG projects. For 5 years after project completion, which is the date when the CDBG project completion certification letter is issued by Decker, there can be no change in use of the project site property that has been acquired or improved with CDBG funding assistance, unless the UGLUG meets certain requirements and the change is pre-approved by Decker. Otherwise, CDBG funds must be returned to the state, which are then returned to HUD. An example of this would be using CDBG funds to build a senior center, and then changing the use of that facility to an ineligible project, like a community center in a non-LMI community within the 5 years after the CDBG project is completed. Contact Decker for more information and guidance on this issue. I'll now hand it over to Joanna, who will discuss contract review and execution.
Thank you, Sally. We did have a couple of questions pop up in the chat that I'd like to address right away. The first one being, how long after sending in pre-agreement documents will the municipality need to wait to have a contract executed with DOA? We're working to get this completed as soon as possible. We just received word this week that the official contract language has been approved, so all of your assigned program representatives are currently working to finalize that, and they'll be sending you copies to review just to make sure we have everything correct before we have it executed. We also have a question.
Joe, I want to add to that though. So just everyone should be aware that we are not the only entity within the state getting contracts approved and drafted. So that is something that you do have to consider. So we commit to, our goal is within 60 days. Sometimes it's much sooner than that. Usually it's closer to around 30 days or less from when we get complete, fully approved pre-agreement documents, but do note that it's really dependent on how many grant agreements DOA is handling at a time, and there are dozens of grant programs that they work with, so just be aware of that.
It is a busy time of year. Our goal, I know, is to work to have contracts with you executed at least no later than the end of the year. We do have requirements for allocating and assigning dollars so that we can show HUD the money is going to be used, but we will work to try to get those done as soon as possible. All right, for your contract review and execution, I know Angela already covered this briefly, but a friendly reminder, carefully read and follow the project timeline and deliverables as they're listed in your executed grant agreement. We also want to give you a heads up and a warning to try to avoid, wherever possible, incurring any hard costs before your contract, or what we call the grant agreement with DOA, is executed. You, as the grantee, are responsible for all prime and subcontracts executed prior to the DOA grant agreement execution. And if you are in a tight situation, bidding and needing to lock down prime or subcontractors and feel that you need to move forward with at least getting those contracts finalized, not yet beginning work, because you don't want to do that until you have a DOA executed grant agreement. But if you do need to take that extra step, we strongly request or suggest that you include or consider including a cancellation clause just in the event that there are any delays or hindrances with getting the DOA contract executed. When it comes to incurring project costs, there are several costs associated with your project. As you may have attended application training earlier in the year, you may have already incurred architectural or engineering A&E costs, which could be counted as match towards your project, and those may have occurred prior to application submission, enabling you to have a design ready to go and the corresponding biddable documents needed for our application submission. After your date of CDBG award, you may have begun incurring grant administration and or planning costs if you're a planning grant recipient. So that's working us forward now to execution of your DOA grant agreement. Please note that you cannot incur any acquisition, relocation, or construction costs until your environmental compliance or certification is completed, which I believe is true for all of our 2024 PF projects at this time, and you have a grant agreement or contract executed with DOA. If any of you are in other places, depending on the program, CDBG program dollars you're working with, just note that you want to hold off on incurring those hard costs until you do for sure have the DOA grant agreement executed and all of your environmental work is completed. So when it comes to bidding and procurement, for our 2024 PF awards, we have some friendly bidding reminders. We encourage you to start as soon as possible to ensure a timely construction start and subsequent on-time project completion for your grant funds. We also encourage you to refer to the prior to construction section of your CDBG contracts timetable. This will give additional guidance on the construction bidding related documents that need to be submitted to our Decker staff and any additional activities that you need to complete, items that you need to prepare and have systems ready to go. I see we have a quick question in the chat. What is an UGLUG? An UGLUG is a unit of general local government. We also refer to those as our grantees or our municipalities. Thank you for that question. So we'll continue on with bidding and procurement information. This is a very high level review and overview of key points for administering your project. We are not going to delve very deep today, so it's vital that you go back and refer to the CDBG implementation handbook that we have posted online, specifically chapters 3 and chapter 7 if your project specifically includes construction work. And definitely make sure to refer to the handbook attachment 3F. This will provide additional guidance. Please note that contracting for professional services is permitted contingent upon remaining compliant with applicable procurement requirements. So for professional services, we generally include in this category grant administration services, architectural and engineering or AE services, planning services, acquisition services, relocation services, and other similarly related items. For incurring CDBG funded costs, please make sure that you're complying with both the CDBG program requirements and your local policies and procedures. So this includes both state-related rules and those rules or ordinances specific to your municipality. For match-funded costs or costs incurred with which you'll be paying match funds, again, for all construction-related activities, you must comply with both the CDBG requirements and local policies. For non-construction activities, quite often deemed a set of professional services, you must at a minimum comply with the local municipalities' local policies. Exceptions for competitive procurement when using or intending to use CDBG dollars to pay for those activities include contracts with other municipalities, contracts with regional planning commissions, RPCs, and most contracts with publicly funded nonprofit economic development organizations. These are viewed by HUD to be quasi-governmental, and therefore competitive procurement is not necessarily required. I also want to highlight for you handbook attachment 3I. This clearly details what will be required for contract language and insertions pertaining to CDBG equal opportunities and various other compliance requirements. So when it comes to procurement for CDBG projects, regardless of what type of project it may be, these requirements apply to all aspects of your project. So this could be contracting in association with, as we said earlier, grant administration, planning, training or instruction, environmental review work, acquisition and relocation activities, straightforward construction, along with the use of financial auditors and appraisals. These rules and requirements also apply to all purchasing for your project related to construction supplies, office supplies, if applicable, food, again, depending on the program or type of CDBG project you're working on, rentals or leases of space, land, or equipment, equipment purchases, and programming purchases as well. This slide provides a quick overview of some Wisconsin state statutes that are specific to public works procurement. If you're not already familiar with these items, please look through the requirement topic, the second column here on the right, and look at the type of municipality or grantee that you are. If you are a county, a town, a village, a city, or for general municipalities, all of these statutes will provide additional rules and regulations. So when it comes to beginning the procurement process, you need to ask yourself a couple of quick questions. First, who will be performing the work? Then, what type of work is needed to be done? And what funds do you intend to use to pay for that work? These slides go into additional details. When it comes to determining who will be doing the work, you essentially need to ask yourself, are we going to be using in-house staff? Essentially, this would be labor provided by the grantee, the UGLUG, or a similar governmental, quasi-governmental subrecipient, maybe an RPC or an EDO, an economic development organization. If that's the case, competitive procurement would not necessarily be required. This would essentially be considered force account work. And you would need to make sure that you have the intergovernmental agreements and that those must be in writing. So you still have to have an understanding, even if you're using in-house staff. For work or labor that will be provided by non-governmental third parties, such as external firms or contractors, whether they're prime or subcontractors, procurement procedures are required, and those agreements and contracts, again, must be in writing. When determining the type of work that needs to be done, essentially you'll need to determine if it's going to be construction related or non-construction related, which could include both supplies and professional services. For construction-related contracts, you need to comply with all local, state, and federal requirements, regardless of the funding source. And I also want to bring up here that if your CDBG-funded project is also pulling in funding from other entities, be aware that the use of those other funds may impose upon you additional rules and restrictions and requirements. So for construction-related contracts, this requires competitive processes unless, for some reason, Decker grants you or approves an exception, in which case you need to reach out to your designated Decker program representative. For professional services and non-construction contracts, the competitive procurement processes are required if that activity will be funded in whole or in part with any CDBG dollars. Again, here the exceptions would be intergovernmental agencies, RPCs, and certain economic development organizations. You also need to make sure that you're complying with your local policies or ordinances, and at a minimum, complying with all of those if you're using only match funds to pay for that activity. However, you do need to include certain contract language regardless of the funding source. So the third aspect here, determining what funds will pay for the work. Again, you be using CDBG dollars, even if it's just $1 it's still CDBG dollars. So whether the contracts are funded in whole or in part, you must comply with the most restrictive requirements of all applicable local, state, and federal requirements. If you're only using local dollars or what we consider match funding, you need to make sure that you're complying with your local policies and any rules and regulations associated with the quote unquote other match that you're providing towards this project. We recommend you consider updating your local policies or ordinances to incorporate best practices. We have more information on this in Chapter 3 and in 2 CFR 200. Please, again, remember, you still have to have state and federal compliance required for certain activities, such as the contract content and construction activities. So when it comes to setting up your contracts and knowing what contract language to include along with additional attachments, please refer to attachment 3I in the implementation handbook. This provides a nice table that allows you to designate whether or not items are construction related or non-construction related. And it also provides rules and regulations related to the size or the amount of the contract. You can see that different attachments are required dependent upon whether the construction contract is of $10,000 value or less, or if it is greater than $10,000 in value. Please note that the items listed here are required to be in the contracts or considered part of the contracts versus being provided separately or at a different later time to your prime and subcontractors. Additional considerations when you're going through the bidding, procurement, and contracting process is to make sure that you have mechanisms for disclosure and review in place to look for potential conflicts of interest. Refer to attachments 3B and 3C and review your local policies and ordinances for any additional rules that apply. When it comes to utilizing MBE WBEs, known as Minority Business Enterprises and Women-Owned Business Enterprises, Section 3 or LMI, low and moderate income businesses, or other local or small business participation, please refer to our attachments 6A, 6B2, 6C, 6D, and 7R. CDBG also requires that we have lobbying activity restrictions and the disclosure of any lobbying activities that occur. So refer to our attachments 3D and 3E for additional information. We have highlighted here as well that there are BABA requirements. BABA stands for the Build America, Buy American Act. And there are additional waiver specifications detailed in our implementation handbook. Specifically, you'll want to take a look at attachments 6J and 6K. It's important to note that no debarred contractors can interact with your CDBG project. You'll want to and need to check the System for Award Management, known as SAM or sam.gov, to double check all of your prime and subcontractors and any other firms that you contract with to ensure that they are not debarred. So just a brief overview here, the Build America, Buy American BABA Act. We have a Buy America preference, BAP, BAP, or domestic procurement requirement in that products purchased in connection with infrastructure projects funded by any federal financial assistance or FFA programs must be produced in the United States. And the purpose of this is to bolster critical American supply chains, stimulate private sector investments in the American manufacturing system, and to support the creation of jobs so that America's workers and firms can compete and lead globally. You'll need to review Chapter 3 in more detail, but BABA applies to CDBG projects, especially those that do involve construction. And you'll want to refer to attachments 3J and 3K for more information. There are waivers possible. These are deemed either general or project specific, and you'll want to reach out to your assigned Decker program representative to discuss whether these will be applicable to your situation. For grantee requirements, there is a BABA contract insertion, attachment 3J, that needs to be in all prime and subcontracts. And please note, your contractors must maintain records verifying compliance with the BABA requirements. And this is especially true for the iron and steel, and in this case, in 2024, construction projects. I'm sorry, construction products. This is a new addition. When it comes to the competitive procurement process, there are several methods that are detailed in Chapter 3 and listed in Attachment 3F. We do have a couple of exceptions for professional services, but want you to note that there are no multiple services procurement and contracting restrictions. So the exceptions here are that the same firm or a single firm could potentially provide preliminary engineering work and subsequent project engineering work after the CDBG award was provided to your municipality. The rules here being that they needed to have been procured together at the same time and subsequently need to be part of a single contract. The same is true for a firm that may have provided CDBG application preparation services and potentially subsequent CDBG project administration services. And the third exception would be a single firm that may have provided CDBG planning application preparation services and subsequent planning or plan creation services. For professional services procurement, you may have recalled this from your initial application training. We do not allow for loss leader arrangements, so there can be no discounted or free grant application preparation or preliminary engineering estimates in exchange for contract award if you as a grantee received a subsequent CDBG funding for your application. There's also ineligibility for contract awards. If a firm helps you as a municipality write an RFP, a request for proposals, that firm cannot then submit a proposal or quote in hopes of getting that contract award. They would be viewed as having basically insider information. So they can't both help write the RFP and then bid on the RFP. I'm going to hand it over now to Sally to cover some of the common pitfalls we encounter with procurement.
Thank you, Joanna. Some common pitfalls for procurement include not following your local procurement policies, not competitively procuring when intending to fund with CDBG in whole or in part, not obtaining 3 written quotes or not making the RFP publicly available for professional services when intending to fund with CDBG, and not having all the RFP and RFQ documentation on file. Additional common pitfalls for procurement include not having all of the CDBG language in the prime contracts and in the subcontracts, not following potential conflicts of interest review requirements, and not conducting SAM debarment checks at the time of contracting or not having SAM records on file at all. In preparation of the project monitoring, procurement-related documents may be located in several subfolders of the CDBG project file, such as procurement and contracting, labor standards, equal opportunity and semi-annual reporting, and financial management. At the time of contracting, it is helpful to obtain the required information from the prime contractor and from its subcontractors as contracting occurs. Additional information such as Section 3 reports, weekly payrolls, and supporting documentation from your contractors and subcontractors make the monitoring reporting process orderly and more simplified. For additional information, please refer to these websites to assist in managing your program. What is highlighted here is an update to information previously provided from the Wisconsin state statutes. We're now going to cover key highlights for maintaining CDBG program compliance. We will also refer to the example grant agreement that was provided to you, or we encourage you to use your own draft grant agreement or executed version. You can see a screenshot of it on your screen. As a reminder, the red disclaimer at the bottom of the handout indicates that this is only provided as an example. You can see your grant or contract number located in the upper right-hand corner. For the project scope of work, several examples of typical scopes of work are included for your reference. For a planning project, the scope of work is to create the updated plan. Some details, such as linear feet, may not be included to allow for small adjustments as needed in your project. Additionally, roadway reconstruction may appear generic or without details such as particular layers in your scope of work. Review the grant agreement timetable to determine which documents are applicable and due for the reporting period. The example shown here lists many items needed to be completed prior to the construction start period or prior to the acquisition. The preliminaries can be labor intensive, so make sure to get your project off on the right foot. In Part 2 of the attachments A through F of the grant agreement, the environmental review is covered. All 2024 PF projects have completed their environmental reviews. For other 2024, 2025, and future reviews, an environmental review training was held in early 2024 and the recording was posted online. Updates are posted online as information becomes known, and the CARES Act projects and non-PF projects' environmental review requirements may differ. For more information, please refer to Chapter 4 in the Implementation Handbook on Environmental Reviews. Additional questions, please contact the DOA Environmental Help Desk at the email address shown here. And now I'll turn things back over to Joanna for our next session on acquisition and relocation.
Thank you, Sally. So Part 2 of your contract will deal with a timetable, and one of the items, if it's applicable to your project, listed under the prior to construction and acquisition section may be acquisition and or relocation services, as highlighted here with our little red hand. Acquisition and relocation information can be found in Chapter 5 of our Implementation Handbook. And we're highlighting this for you because we have had in the last year several text updates and additional guidance and clarifications that have been provided not only to us at Decker from HUD, but that we have then transposed to provide to you in our Implementation Handbook. It's important to note that we do have updated guidance for and references to what's called the URA final rule. And we'll get into more details on this momentarily. But this final rule became effective as of June 3rd of this year. We also have updates to the chapter attachments, specifically attachments 5C, D, F, H, L, M, and N. This is a list of the relevant laws and regulations that apply to acquisition and relocation activities. You can see it's fairly extensive, and we have highlighted here in the middle that updated FHWA published URA new rule. Again, the item just became effective as of June 3rd of 2024. URA applicability, this applies to publicly funded projects where the buyer may be the UGLUG or municipality or other entity. URA rules also apply to the acquisition, which includes easements, the rehabilitation and the demolition of any real property. And URA provides relocation assistance for displaced persons. So this could include the individuals themselves, businesses, farms, nonprofit organizations, and it also includes any personal property that would belong to those items, whether they're individuals, businesses, farms, or nonprofits. There are two types of acquisition, either voluntary or involuntary. To be deemed voluntary, you must meet a precise list of requirements. Everything else is involuntary. So for voluntary acquisition, there must be no threat of use of eminent domain authority, otherwise generally referred to as condemnation. And that's something that as a municipality, you likely have that authority. So you could exercise it, but there can be no threat of using it. Voluntary acquisition would also apply to any acquisition for which the buyer does not have those eminent domain powers. And again, you must meet specific criteria to be deemed voluntary acquisition. Please note here that a willing owner, an owner willing to sell either their property, their building, etc., having a willing owner does not constitute voluntary acquisition. So those are not synonymous. For involuntary acquisition, these would be any acquisition activities that don't qualify as voluntary. And there would be there could be the potential for use of eminent domain authority or condemnation. We also have easements included in acquisition, and these may be voluntary or involuntary, and they may be deemed temporary or permanent. For voluntary acquisition to be the correct designation, all of the following must be true. It should not be a specific site needed for the project, as in the municipality or the CDBG grantee should have multiple options available of where they could perform the project. If the project absolutely must occur at a designated site, because maybe it's a new well that you're putting in, and that's the only place where you can find adequate water, then it's likely not going to be deemed voluntary acquisition. So the municipality needs to have options of where they can choose to go. The property must also not be part of any intended, planned, or designated project area where other properties, essentially surrounding properties, will be acquired within a specific set of time limits. So if it's part of a larger development, odds are very good it won't fall under the categorization of voluntary acquisition. You must also inform the owner of the property that the property will not be acquired by condemnation if negotiations fail. And you must inform the owner in writing of the property's current fair market value. For this, refer to attachment 5B. This is a template that we have available for your use in association with our handbook. When it comes to involuntary acquisition, again, any property acquisition that doesn't meet the criteria, all of the criteria on the prior slide, would be categorized then as involuntary acquisition. You as the UGLUG or municipality may or may not opt to exercise your power of eminent domain authority to acquire that property. And please note that if the determination is that the acquisition is involuntary, this triggers the full URA requirements. Easements are defined as the right to use the real property of another for a specific purpose without profit. URA applicability indicates that this applies to both voluntary and involuntary easements. Easements could be temporary, which are granted for a specific period of time, or they could be permanent, in which case the easements are attached to a deed and continue to affect the land through subsequent changes in ownership. For temporary easements and URA applicability, there would be a temporary limited easement would be for the use of sole benefit for the owner or resident. If this is the situation that you encounter, you'll need to email a letter to our Decker program representative staff and maintain it in the file. And this specifically will be attachment 5E from your implementation handbook. So in addition to acquisition, relocation may be applicable to your project. For activities that are deemed or determined to be voluntary acquisition, owner occupants of that property would not qualify for relocation assistance. However, their tenant occupants, if they exist, must be provided notices of relocation rights. Please note their rights cannot be waived, and they must be provided relocation assistance if they are displaced. For activities that are determined to be involuntary acquisition, both owner occupants and tenant occupants must be given the full list of notices of their relocation rights. Again, their rights cannot be waived, and they must be provided relocation assistance if they or their items are displaced. Refer to attachments 5F through 5I in the implementation handbook. And we highlight these because they have been recently updated or revised. Each municipality must also have a relocation plan. This is a state and federal requirement. As part of your application process, you are likely required to submit it to our staff. If you do not already have one, you must prepare a plan in the event that any relocation may be necessary for a particular project. We have plan templates available on the state relocation website, which is run by our DOA Division of Legal Services. And note that prior to the initiation of any negotiations, which includes any verbal commitments for relocation purposes, you must submit a relocation plan to and receive approval of that plan from our DOA Division of Legal Services. You'll also need to, if you haven't done so already, submit a copy of that approved plan to our Decker staff.
Joel, hello everyone, this is Angela again. I just want to clarify. So with your application, you submitted what's called a RADRAP, the Residential Anti-Displacement and Relocation Plan. That is different than this, so all of you had to submit that with your application. This particular piece 2 refers to the relocation plan if you actually have relocation for your project. So if there's any displacement or potential displacement, then you must prepare the state's DOA division's state relocation plan, and they have templates depending on what the nature of the displacement is. So just clarifying, it's only this particular plan is only required for those who will or potentially have relocation for their project. Thanks.
So in addition to potentially having a project-specific relocation plan, please note that LMI residents may have applicable relocation provisions in your particular case. There are special provisions for low-income housing and LMI, or low and moderate income residential owners and tenants. And these are described in Section 104D of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, often referred to as Barney-Frank. You'll need to refer to attachments 5G and 5I, which was recently revised in your implementation handbook, and note that you must meet the low and moderate income thresholds based on the current HUD URA income limits. So when it comes to acquisition and relocation, you want to be aware of and pay particular attention to the timing of this work throughout the course of your project. If either acquisition and/or relocation likely apply to your project, you'll need to notify DECR, specifically your assigned DECR program representative, prior to the start of any work dealing with acquisition or relocation. Refer to attachment 5L, which was recently revised, in completing this document and submitting it to us. You'll need to inform us if acquisition for a property occurred prior to your CDBG award. There may be additional paperwork or items that we need to resolve. Note that no construction on property can begin until the acquisition, relocation, or combined AR processes are completed. If you intend on using CDBG funds to cover any acquisition costs, whether in whole or in part for those acquisition activities, you must have an environmental review that is complete and certified by our environmental review desk. And DECR, or DOA, our grant agreement with your municipality must be fully executed. So for acquisition and relocation processes, for voluntary acquisition processes, refer to attachment 5C. This again was recently revised and updated. For involuntary acquisition processes, refer to attachment 5D. And for relocation processes, refer to attachments 5F, 5H, and 5I. These have been recently revised or updated, and they also now include the URA new rule. Note that if persons will or potentially will be displaced as a result of your project, then those relocation notices and assistance activities may end up occurring throughout the acquisition process and after acquisition is complete, and possibly even after the CDBG project is complete. So those may be ongoing through and potentially after completion of the CDBG project. Our website contains several templates and forms that are available for your use. All of the documents that we've been referring to in this section are part of the attachments for Chapter 5 in our handbook. And here is the link as well for the HUD Tenant Assistance Relocation and Real Property Acquisition Handbook. We have highlighted here at the bottom of the slide just a general notice that our templates are for guidance only. You can certainly utilize them, and we encourage you to customize them for your particular needs and the needs of your project. Please make sure to consult your local professional, legal, or real estate counsel prior to proceeding through the acquisition and/or relocation processes. It just is another way that you can make sure all of your bases are covered. When it comes to acquisition and relocation documentation to have on file and in preparation for monitoring, we do have a specific A&R checklist. This is attachment 5K. And you as municipalities, if this is applicable to your project, will be required to submit these documents at the time of our monitoring process for your project. Your assigned Decker program representative will work with you to schedule that event and provide you additional information and guidance at that time. I'm now going to hand it over to Sally to cover our common pitfalls related to acquisition and relocation.
Thank you, Joanna. Some common pitfalls in acquisition and relocation processes include an incorrect classification of the acquisition type, a failure to submit a notice to Decker of acquisition relocation prior to starting the acquisition relocation process, insufficient records for fair market value determinations, failure to obtain a signed waiver of appraisal for donated property, failure to provide required notices to owners and tenants, and having approval for relocation plan prior to initiation of negotiations, and incomplete records of relocation communications with an assistance to involuntary owners and tenants. Noted here are helpful websites for acquisition and relocation questions. Additionally, the URA final rule effective June 3rd of this year is highlighted here. We will now cover some important timeline and performance period highlights. For PFs, the construction start date is on or before July 1st of the first construction season. For planning contracts, planning activities generally need to begin within 6 months of the grant award. Refer to your executed grant agreement for more information. Other programs may have different required start dates. Refer to your executed grant agreement for more details. It is important to refer to your grant agreement for many required deadlines when considering reporting dates, fair housing action deadlines, the second citizen participation hearing date, as well as monitoring dates. Be aware of the construction end date or planning activities end date for planning projects. Additionally, the final payment request and project completion documents must be received prior to the performance period end date. Final payments will not be issued until all completion documents are submitted and approved. And now Joanna will continue with information on labor standards.
Thank you, Sally. So for the list that was just on the last slide, we're going to delve down a little bit into each one of those, starting out with that construction start and labor standards requirements. Again, construction for our public facilities projects must start by July 1st or earlier. Please plan on earlier. July 1st would be the deadline for starting work. And note that the federal labor standards will be applicable to all construction projects. This is often referred to as Davis-Bacon. Please refer to Chapter 3. We highlight here attachments 3I and 3J, along with Chapters 6 and 7 for multiple rules and regulations for labor standards. We also have the US DOL final rule. This is not URA, this is US DOL final rule that became effective October 23rd of last year. So Davis-Bacon and related acts, often referred to as Davis-Bacon or the DBRA, are for CDBG and other federally funded construction projects, specifically where there is construction, alteration, or repair of a public building or public work. Projects with other funding sources will need to follow not only our CDBG rules, but they will also need to follow the applicable rules and regulations for those other funding programs. That may include DNR, DOT, DOR, DOC, etc. Davis-Bacon does not apply to non-construction projects, such as planning or planning only projects, public services projects, and those CV or COVID response projects that do not include construction activities. So the Davis-Bacon Act requires that workers must be paid at least weekly, and they must be paid at least the federal wages for similar work in their locality. This refers basically to wage determinations as they are set up as federal wages for the U.S. Department of Labor, or USDOL. Any violation of these rules could result in the contractor being liable for unpaid wages and potentially facing additional penalties, fines, suspension of their payments, contract termination, and/or suspension or debarment. This is why earlier we brought up the SAM.gov debarment checks to make sure that as you're bringing prime and subcontractors onto your project, that they don't have a history or any current issues related to following these rules. There are some exceptions for Davis-Bacon. This includes force account work. Again, this would be utilizing quote unquote in-house staff to perform some duties, and you can refer to Chapter 7 and specifically Attachment 7Q for additional guidance. Other exceptions would be construction activities assisted solely by means of loans guaranteed with interest-bearing collateral accounts, along with the residential rehabilitation of structures with fewer than 8 units. Those would generally apply to housing-related projects. Exceptions also apply to contracts that are part of a project that is less than $2,000 in total value. Almost all of our grants, if not all of our grants, are significantly higher than that in value. And there may be additional exceptions for economic development projects where federal funds are used only, again, for non-construction activities. So a word of warning: failure to comply with Davis-Bacon or the federal labor standards rules could result in a loss of the municipality's awarded grant, those CDBG dollars. It could jeopardize the municipality potentially from obtaining future grants, and all of the contractors associated with the project could be subject to fines, imprisonment, and/or debarment from future federally funded projects. Those contractors that are specifically running into issues. Additional relevant laws that will potentially apply to your project include the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act. This deals with payroll deductions. Please note that a violation of the Copeland Act, Anti-Kickback Act is considered a felony, and it may result in termination of the contract or criminal prosecution by the U.S. government and is punishable by fines, imprisonment, or both. So they're very serious about these items. Additional laws include the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, which deals with overtime pay, specifically when more than 40 hours of work are performed in a single week. And this applies to contracts over $100,000 in value. But please note that it does include any subcontractors associated with the originating contract. Penalties and fines can be assessed in the form of liquidated damages and back wages, and there's the potential of other fines or penalties being applied. With Contract Work Hours and the Safety Standards Act, the liability cascades from the SOBs and the primes to the grantee, so to the UGLUG or the municipality who DOA Decker has primarily contracted with. We also have the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which also deals with wages and overtime. And this generally applies to those contracts that are equal to or under $100,000 in value. Each of you as a grantee needs to have a designated labor standards officer. And as part of your pre-agreement documentation, you should have filled in and submitted a Labor Standards Officer Designee form. This is attachment 7C. And this should be submitted prior to or at the time of submitting your record of wage decision selection. That'll be attachment 7D. If you do have any changes in staffing during the course of your project, please note as one of the pre-agreement documents for submission, you may need to update that to notify our Decker program representatives. You as the municipality must act as the Labor Standards Officer, or LSO, unless a different person is officially designated in that role. So by default, it falls to the municipality, which would likely be the clerk. For labor standards officers, you have a wide range of responsibilities. You need to review the federal wage determinations and the wage decision modifications prior to bid opening. We strongly recommend that you do not open bids on Fridays. We have separate wage rate and procurement and contracting recordings posted online that go into more details, and our implementation handbook has additional information on this. You'll also be responsible for requesting additional labor classifications if needed for your project, and ensuring that the bid notifications go out. You'll also be responsible for confirming your contractor eligibility clearance, basically those SAM.gov debarment checks, and for any construction-related contract notifications. You're also responsible for holding a pre-construction conference if the municipality chooses to do so. This is not a requirement. However, we do strongly encourage you to hold pre-construction meetings. You'll also be responsible for compliance monitoring and compliance enforcement for all of your primes and subs. For federal wage determinations, we follow the 90-day rule. If a contract is awarded more than 90 days after the initial bid opening, you'll be responsible to check to see whether or not the wage determination has since been updated. If it has, you'll be required to use the most current modified decision that has been updated and apply that to the contract prior to execution of your construction contracts. We also have an additional new rule that recently went into effect. If there is any substantial amendment or change order to your contracts, this may require checking and using, again, the most current wage decision for the work covered under the amendment or change order, whenever that may occur during the course of your project performance period. Failing to obtain a correct federal wage determination for the bidding process can create quite a bit of headache. So you as the municipality must correct any errors. You'll need to obtain the correct wage decisions, inform contractors that they must pay those wage rates retroactively, if it applies, to the beginning of the project or the beginning of whenever the work occurred. And you also need to verify that wage restitution and underpayments have been made, along with potentially being forced to reimburse the contractor if the original contract does not cover those expenses. So for bid packets and construction contracts, please note that notices regarding our CDBG requirements are applicable to all construction projects, and they must be included in the bid packets and the prime contracts. You'll want to refer to Attachment 3I, the Contract Attachment Insertions Summary in Chapter 3, for a list of all of the required and recommended bid packet insertions. Also refer to Attachment 7F, this is labeled the Advertisement for Bids template in Chapter 7, for additional guidance on the content of the advertisement for bids. Required for all prime contracts and subcontracts are the same language, clauses, and wage decisions that were required for bid packet. So they need to be both in the bid packet and in the executed contracts. There are additional requirements when it comes to subcontracts. All subcontracts must be in writing, and they must include the name of the contractor or subcontractor, the dollar amount of the contract, a list of the goods and services to be provided, and they must detail the terms and conditions of the agreement. A copy of all executed subcontracts with any and all attachments and signed addendums must be in the CDBG project file. These items in particular are most definitely reviewed during the monitoring process. Inclusion of the required CDBG notices, attachments, and wage determinations in the bid packets and contracts by reference only is not acceptable. So you can't have a simple line in there saying, oh yeah, we also include this particular document. The full language needs to be included in both the bid packets and the contracts. You also need to make sure that your contractors are eligible or cleared for work on the project. All contractors, including the company and the owners, must be deemed eligible for participating in federally funded contracting. You must verify that they are not barred. Prime contractors must ensure that all of their subcontractors are eligible. However, our past experience has shown that prime contractors don't necessarily always do this. So you as the municipality, the grantee, the one that is signed off on the contract with DOA, should also check to confirm that all of the subcontractors are eligible to participate. Make sure that you communicate with your prime contractors and that you're getting updates if and when any new subcontractors are added to the project. The record of debarment checks, sometimes referred to as exclusion checks, must be performed for all contractors, primes and subs, and for the owners, officers, and those items must be in the CDBG project file. So you'll be searching not only for the name of the firm, but also double checking the names of the owners of those firms as well. Contact your DECRA program representative immediately If you encounter any issues or if it appears that any contractor is or has become debarred. Additional items to keep in mind. It's really useful to have that pre-construction conference. Again, it's not required, but is strongly recommended. Compliance monitoring will be a large portion of your work as a grant administrator. So make sure that you're reviewing those payrolls, wages, overtime, fringes, deductions, classifications, along with the apprentices and trainees' indenture papers. It'll also involve worksite monitoring, compliance enforcement, documentation submissions to your assigned program representatives here at Decker, and also just generally maintaining all of the paperwork, the file contents, and preparing for monitoring. Any and all bidding, contracting, and labor standards related documents may be requested by our Decker staff for review during the monitoring and project review processes. At this time, I'm going to hand it back over to Sally. She'll take us through several of the common pitfalls related to labor standards.
Thank you, Joe. Some common pitfalls in labor standards practices include not submitting the record of wage decision selection to Decker prior to advertisement for bids release, an incorrect wage determination selected or used, insufficient fringe benefits and deductions payroll documentation on file, not requesting additional classification when it was warranted, not checking payroll records weekly, miscalculations for overtime underpayments, not following up on payroll or employee interview discrepancies, and not reporting underpayments on the semi-annual CDBG data report and the final labor standards compliance report. Additional helpful websites on labor standards are listed here. Also, on the DOA Bureau of Community Development website, you can find the CDBG requirements and the Contractor's Guide to Using Prevailing Wages, among other helpful documents. Now we'll cover the highlights of Chapters 6 and 9 of the handbook. This diagram outlines the communication process between different participants in the project. Reporting requirements and forms are found in Chapter 6 and 9. Your grant agreement timetable will indicate which and when the reports are due. Additional information regarding timeframes for reporting can be found in the grant agreement's attachments A, E, and F. Contractors and subs must supply information to the UGLUG, and the UGLUG has the authority to withhold payment if contractors do not provide required information. The UGLUGs then provide detailed information on the project to Decker. Decker supplies the information to HUD, and HUD reports to Congress. Congress must obtain information on how funds are spent, as they are accountable for that distribution. Reporting this information helps Congress in determining future funding needs. Multiple reports will apply to your project. Please check your grant agreement for the reports that apply to your project and the timeline associated for due dates and submissions. We recommend that once you have your grant agreement timetable, put those reminders on your calendar for staying on task and compliant with required actions and reports. You will need to complete many reports and actions according to your grant agreement timetable. Payment requests may be put on hold, and you may receive findings or concerns during monitoring if reports and actions are not completed on time. Shown is a screenshot of a current contract. In this example, the timetable details many of the consistent dates which require report submission. If you have your contract in front of you, you can follow along to see these important dates specifically for March, April, September, and October. For those that report semi-annually, some projects require quarterly reporting. Once the project is completed and final documentation has been submitted, a reminder that final financial documents and the certification of completion is due within 60 days to officially wrap up your paperwork. As a reminder, the UGLUG is responsible for complying with and observing all applicable federal and state laws, ordinances, and regulations which are in effect during the performance period of the grant agreement. Again, multiple reports will apply to your project. It is imperative to use the current version of forms for each reporting period. You can find these on the Implementation Handbook website with the screenshot shown here. Additional documents are posted on our website. Walkthroughs or step-by-step recordings are also posted. The instructions for completing forms are usually listed at the end of the form. There are tabs within the individual forms provided to give instructions. There may also be additional guidance or notes when the cursor hovers over cells in Excel. Our website includes additional documents which feature both the form as well as the instructions for completing the form, as shown in red here. Additionally, for reporting forms in an Excel format, check the bottom of the document to find an Instructions tab to complete the form, shown in the red circle here. Also, this screenshot highlights the additional guidance in Excel, which shows information or tips on how to complete the form when the cursor hovers over the cell. This is a closer look, which shows the small red corner image indicating a tip is available to read. Some common reporting pitfalls include missing or inaccurate details, late reports, unsigned or incomplete reports, unreported issues, failing to include supporting documents, and lacking required content. Please double-check your work prior to submission, as incomplete reports will not be accepted. Here are some helpful websites on reporting. And now I'll turn things back over to Joanna for more information on fair housing actions.
Thank you, Sally. If you have your documents in front of you, whether it's the example we provided for training today or a draft copy of your grant agreement attachments A through F, or an executed contract, I'd recommend that you peruse that right now. Specifically, we're going to focus in here on attachment F, what's labeled as the program rules. Each of you will likely have at least 3 fair housing activities listed in your contract that need to be completed. The due date for these items are listed in the timetable, so attachment A of the document. And we highlight this because failure to complete these activities by that due date may result in suspension of your funds until those activities are completed. So we don't want you to have to deal with delayed payment requests, and certainly not have your contractors or subcontractors experience further delays in getting paid. Make sure that you're completing those items on time. And just as a point of reference, those fair housing actions are drafted based on what you initially provided with your CDBG applications. If during the course of the project something changes and or you as the municipality would like to change, swap out maybe one or two activities, please reach out to your DECR program representative and we can iron out those issues. We don't recommend making major changes, but if something happens that needs to facilitate that, we can usually work with you. It's also important to note in your attachment A timetable, the second citizen participation public hearing. You are required to have a public hearing prior to application submission to our program. You are required to hold at least a second public hearing, and this needs to occur after, in the case of a project involving construction, after that construction has started and during the active construction period. So basically before the construction is ended. The purpose of this is to provide your local citizens and residents with updates as to how the work is going and to give them an opportunity to provide feedback before all of the work is done. For planning projects, this second public participation hearing would need to occur after the planning process has begun and before the plan is finalized. Generally, we try to set these up to be completed around the end of March, but refer to your particular grant agreement for the exact deadline listed. So there'll be not only a due date listed in your timetable, but then the next subsequent semi-annual or quarterly reporting period will also detail what information needs to be provided and reported with your reporting submission. In this instance, you'll need to complete the appropriate paperwork and submit the public hearing documents, which would include a hearing notice along with the publisher's affidavit of publication or a clerk's certification of the notices being posted as applicable and in accordance with your grantee citizen participation plan. If you're not aware of your current citizen participation plan or haven't reviewed it in a while, it would be a good idea to take a look at that. Make sure that you're following your own rules. We have had in the past grantees that need to perform a second or maybe even a third second citizen participation public hearing to ensure that they are compliant with their local policies and ordinances. You'll also need to provide to us with your reporting documents a completed certification form, a copy of the hearing minutes, and a copy of the attendance list if the attendees were not already listed in the hearing minutes. A monitoring event will occur at least once during the performance period of your project. We've alluded to this a couple of times already through the presentation, but we just want to give a quick summary of what will occur. We try to provide a minimum of 30 days advance notification in the form of an official notification letter to the municipality. When your assigned DECR program representative is getting ready to schedule monitoring, they will reach out to you and usually work with you to select a date or possibly provide a couple of date options. In the event that your project ends up wrapping up early, you need to let us know. We want to make sure that we're completing monitoring during the performance period of your project. So hopefully before construction is completed. And if you're ahead of schedule, that's great, but we don't want you to end up having to wait on receiving a final payment request if we weren't aware of you ending early and then need to complete monitoring. If for some reason you would like an expedited monitoring process, you may not want to wait 30 days to schedule out that event. Reach out to your Decker program representative and they'll be able to help determine a better schedule that may work for you. You'll need to submit the completed self-monitoring checklist. This is attachment 2B in the implementation handbook, and this has been recently updated. And if it's applicable to your project, you'll also need to complete and submit the acquisition relocation monitoring checklist. This is attachment 5K. This checklist has also recently been updated. Our Decker program representatives will follow up with you to request project file documents and review additional items as needed. We'll then issue a monitoring report, often referred to as a results letter, which will list, if applicable, any findings or concerns. If there are any findings or concerns, you as the municipality may need to perform some corrective actions that may involve responding to the monitoring report and potentially completing additional activities or providing additional supporting documentation. Once everything is cleared up, so any findings or concerns are completely taken care of and resolved, or if there were no findings or concerns, there will be a monitoring completion letter issued from the Decker staff. Please note that CDBG payments will be withheld or essentially put on hold until any necessary corrective actions are completed. Refer to your grant agreement for the non-compliance and failure to perform clauses and any clauses for termination of the grant agreement or payment denials. Again, if for some reason, and I hope everything goes smoothly for you, if your work schedule is on schedule and or hopefully ahead of schedule, please make sure to notify your Decker program representative if you anticipate finishing construction early. For findings versus concerns, we want to provide a couple of quick definitions. A finding represents an issue of non-compliance with our CDBG policies or regulatory requirements. Concerns represent issues with documentation or procedure that don't necessarily represent non-compliance with our policies, the implementation handbook or regulations, but they are significant enough that they need to be addressed to ensure compliance for a particular item so that it does not rise to a later finding. If you're reviewing your grant agreement timetable or the sample that we provided you for training, you'll also see that there's a clearly defined construction period end date, or in the case of planning projects, a planning activities end date. For our public facilities construction projects, we generally set as a default construction to be completed at the end of October of your second full construction season. Since we know in the state of Wisconsin, or we never really know when winter is going to show up. It might show up early, it might show up late, it may not show up at all. And the spring thaw is, or could be, potentially very finicky. If sometimes the thaw is very late, it may end up delaying construction start for that particular season. So we want you to be aware of this construction end date and the importance here in noting that after this date, no construction expenses can be incurred. So your contractors, if they're working up to and through, say, October 31st, it may still be a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks until they get you the invoice for that work that went through October 31st in this example. However, they cannot be incurring any additional costs, say on November 1st, November 3rd, through November 17th, etc. So getting the paperwork and the invoices is separate from actually being on site and incurring additional costs. Detailed in your timetable is also the performance period end date. For our public facilities projects, by default, we try to set this as the end of your second full year, generally listed as December 31st. As of this date, so no later than this date, preferably earlier than this date, you will submit your final payment request and all appropriate supporting documentation, along with a signed and completed project completion report and supporting documents. This packet will feel very similar to all of the semi-annual or potentially quarterly reports that you've submitted previously, but it will also include a final summary narrative along with the data report, a summary of what's occurred, and a final labor standards compliance report. So that'll be a new item for you. It's basically just a full summary of the contracts that were awarded and any underpayments that may have occurred. And we're hopefully at that point all resolved. So if you're looking at your timetable, thinking about putting reminders on your calendar, this final project completion report will feel like a semi-annual or quarterly report, but due to the timing of when it occurs during the calendar year, it may not cover a full, say, 6 months or 3 months, since it'll just be reporting through your performance period end date. So for project completion, again, refer to your grant agreement timetable. Construction is generally scheduled to be completed, or the planning activities are generally scheduled to be completed 60 days prior to the end of your performance period. You'll need to submit that final payment request by that performance period end date. It's really important here that late submissions are ineligible for review and payment. And unfortunately, we have had grantees in the past experience this situation. So the due date listed is the date by which Decker needs to receive your payment request. Think of it like utilizing a gift card. If the gift card has a clear expiration date, and say it goes through the month of August, if I come in and try to use it on September 5th, it's not going to work. I will have forfeited all of those extra dollars, and we don't want you to lose your money. The project completion report and certification, attachment 10A, will essentially be the cover page for your reporting packet. The final semi-annual project data report will feel very similar to what you have previously submitted, either semi-annually or quarterly. And the final financial certification of completion, attachment 10B, will subsequently be due to your Decker program representative within 60 days after you receive your final payment. There may be additional final reporting as specified in your grant agreement timetable, and we'll cover that shortly. So these are just two quick screenshots of the project completion report 10A on the left-hand side. It'll look very similar to the cover page that you submit for semi-annual or quarterly reports. It's just a little bit more expanded, and this is what you'll submit at the end of your project. On the right, we have the financial certification of completion, attachment 10B, and once you receive your CDBG payment request, your final payment request, and all of those dollars are used up and you've cleaned out your bank accounts, all of your contractor and subcontractor invoices have been taken care of and paid, then you'll fill this in to essentially give us a clear, clean snapshot of where all of the money ended up. You also need to sign off on this, so this will be the chief elected official again, as with all of your other semi-annual or quarterly reports. And once you submit this to us, we will then review all of the final paperwork, and hopefully issue you your completion certification. These are the 2 certification forms that are referenced as part of the project completion letter and certifications documents. Remaining documents that may need to be submitted beyond your performance period end date include an annual single audit statement. These are generally always due by January 15th of a given calendar year, and they refer to how much federal funding and costs were incurred by the municipality during the prior calendar year. So for our 2024 PF grantees, you may have a performance period end date of December 31st, 2026. Note that by January 15th of 2027, you'll need to submit the single audit statement for the federal funding and costs incurred during your 2026 calendar year. As we stated, that financial certification of project completion, if you receive your payment about the end of the year or beginning of 2027, then within that 60 days, you'll need to submit this financial certification. Along with it, you'll need to include copies of your final financial journals or ledgers showing that all of the CDBG dollars and match funds have been expended and accounted for, along with copies of any remaining checks outstanding that were issued, and final bank statements showing there's a $0 balance. And that's the $0 is in quotes there in the event that you are required to maintain like a $5 or $25 balance or something in your bank account to hold the account open. We just need you to essentially make sure that all of the money is spent down to that hold open threshold. So the initial $5 or $25 or whatever it may be that the community needed to put in to hold the bank account open, you can return back down to that level as long as the CDBG funds are fully expended and your match funds are fully expended. As I said, Decker will then issue a signed project completion letter along with the approved and signed certifications. With all of that paperwork then come the records retention requirements, and you as the municipality, for the time being, will need to retain those files indefinitely. They can be paper or electronic. You simply need to make sure that you have them readily available, as those agencies or entities that monitor us may wish to also monitor you. So lastly, we want to just cover a couple of quick items regarding preparing for success and following some best practices. We want to make sure that you're utilizing templates, creating and utilizing calendar reminders, checking in frequently, reviewing your local processes, and prepping for the unexpected. So, first step, get organized. Use our Decker templates, and you can even actually begin completing some of these forms right now. Chapter 2 attachments, including the project file checklist. This is recommended but not required. That's attachment 2A. And the self-monitoring checklist, which will be required at the time of monitoring, attachment 2B. You can begin filling those in right now. We encourage that because when monitoring comes, you then don't have to worry about going back and trying to organize everything and fill in the holes in the information. Utilize calendar reminders. Be proactive. Don't wait to submit your orders for supplies and materials. Make sure that you build in cushions to gather reporting information from your primes and subs. And even consider setting up placeholders on your calendar for frequent check-ins with staff, coworkers, municipal entities that need to review, for example, payment requests or other contractor invoices for approval and subsequent payment. Make sure that you're communicating. Set up and clarify expectations. Review everyone's roles and responsibilities. confirm your schedules and availability, along with those local processes, and when in doubt, ask questions. Lastly, you want to be prepared for the unexpected. This is where having a pre-construction meeting or meetings can be extremely helpful. You're putting everybody on notice so that if anything pops up, people will be aware of it as soon as possible, and they'll have a plan in place on how to deal with it. It's also really important to have a financial or payment alternative ready to go if needed. The state of Wisconsin has 30 days from receiving a completed, valid, and accurate payment request to then issue the funds. If there are any issues in terms of errors, missing documentation, inappropriate approvals or authorizations, or inaccurate ledgers or invoices, that can delay the clock from starting for that 30-day payout. So make sure that you're double checking your work. If need be, have somebody else also double check your work before you submit it. And just be prepared. Have maybe a line of credit, a loan, or other general funds available in the event that you need to have a really quick turnaround on payment to your contractors. You can always view the CDBG payment process as more of a reimbursement to the community who may in fact be paying those contracts in real time with general funds for which they would then receive reimbursement from CDBG. You also want to stress the importance of any reporting issues and reporting any delays as soon as possible. And you must obtain approval from Decker before making any changes to your project, especially if it deals with the scope of work, the materials used, or the potential impact it may have, as this may require that our staff work with you on potential contract amendments, and it may also impact your grant eligibility. We want to highlight for you just briefly the amendment provisions in the hopefully unlikely event you need an amendment. Any circumstances that arise, you must be able to show that they have occurred outside the control of you as the grantee or the UGLUG. Quite often, these might be weather-related delays, and or they may apply to separate state agencies, other agencies from which you may be receiving funding for the project that may have encountered other approval delays. Note that rebidding is not an eligible reason to request an amendment or essentially an extension to your either construction start date or the performance period end date if that issue was caused by the UGLUG or the municipality delaying their initial bidding process. Any issues related to amendment provisions need to have resulted in the need for an amendment should be documented in the semi-annual narrative reports, if applicable. So here the reminder is, on your semi-annual narrative reports, no matter how insignificant something may seem, it may only be 3 days, it may be a week or 2 weeks. If some small delay occurred, it's important to note that in your semi-annual or quarterly reporting, because we will go back through those reports to see if those items have basically piled up or experienced kind of a domino effect, which then essentially used up all of the cushions that you had built in to your schedule, which then result in you obviously requesting a need for an amendment to get a timeline extension. The amendment proposal must also be submitted at least 30 days prior to the end of the grant agreement performance period as listed in your contract. So by default for our 2024 public facilities projects, that default end date is December 31st of 2026. We need to have received your request for amendment by essentially the end of November or December 1st. That would be 30 days prior to December 31st. Any amendment requests received after or less than 30 days prior to the end of your performance period will encounter significant delays and generally be viewed as not eligible for review or approval. Lastly, do not rely on amendments to remain in compliance with your grant agreement. Make sure you're following the rules and try to be as timely as possible. Common reasons for having amendments include that new information is learned during the course of the project. You may encounter engineering or design issues, especially for construction. Once you dig into the ground, you may find something you didn't expect to find there, or you may not find what you were looking to find. There may be project scope of work changes due to finding unexpected items. And you may realize that you have maybe unexpected acquisitions or relocations necessary to complete your project. Many times we'll also encounter issues with the project finances or budgets. Often these are related to unforeseen costs that have risen, potentially from design issues or scope of work changes. Many times as well, we recommend starting the bidding process early. Since the pandemic, building and construction costs have risen quite a bit. So you may often find that your initial estimates for what a project was going to cost may be blown out of the water. So just bear that in mind. Also, for project timelines, there may be unexpected construction delays related to weather, supply chain issues quite often. You just want to make sure that you as the municipality have done everything within your power to ensure that things should go smoothly. Sometimes supply chain issues are just unavoidable. And as long as you have done your due diligence, usually we will work with you to try to make everything complete as best as possible. The construction start date and end dates must occur no later than those listed in your grant agreement timetables. And Decker approvals for exceptions are very rare to those amendment requests. Additional resources that are available to you include the Decker staff, the implementation handbook that we've referenced multiple times, our CDBG forms and templates posted on our website, along with our previously recorded trainings. So important next steps. Make sure that you're reviewing the implementation handbook. This includes all chapters, those we've highlighted here and those that we haven't touched upon yet. Make sure you review. There are lots of samples and examples within the handbook itself, along with additional detailed instructions. Several of our reports actually have step-by-step, line-by-line instructions to help walk you through that process. All of the chapters also have additional attachments. Those may be forms or additional templates available to you to use. And make sure that you return your award acceptance and pre-agreement documents as soon as possible if you haven't done that yet. Again, those other big next steps include executing your grant agreement, otherwise known as the contract with DOA Decker, beginning your bidding process, and notifying Decker if any issues pop up. This is a page of our available additional resources, our email for the Bureau of Community Development. Again, this is in addition to first reaching out to your assigned Decker program representative. We also have listed here our Bureau website for the full community resources, CDBG programs, along with our handbook. We want to thank you for your attendance today and also congratulate you again on your recent awards. Our presentation has officially come to an end, but we will open up the discussion for Q&A. Please utilize chat. Feel free to raise your hand. You can use that feature of the Teams meetings as well. And if you're able, you could also potentially unmute your microphone. We just want to make sure that people take turns if they're doing that, so we're able to catch all of the questions. Staff will be available both right now for follow-up questions. We'll stay on the line. And after this presentation, again, feel free to always go back to our contact information here, reach out to your assigned program DECR representative, or certainly feel free to email us at our doacdbg@wisconsin.gov Bureau inbox.
All right, Joe, there are a number of questions that came in, and while we did reply to most of these during the presentation, the chat will not be visible for those who would be reviewing this later for the recording. So I thought we could go through those that have been responded to and then address any that haven't come up, as well as any new questions that people have asked. So I want to go back. We can go back to questions about the grant agreement execution. You had already addressed one during the recording. So an additional item was asking about the deadline for executing the grant agreement, but on the grantee side, so we have expectation that we hope to have the grant agreement executed within 30 to 60 days of receiving the pre-agreement documents. As far as the grantee is concerned, DOA will send you, our fiscal team will send the execute grant agreement to be signed. Typically, they have a 1-week turnaround. If you need additional time due to needing certain approvals or someone is out of town, the chief elected official isn't available, you can request more time, but we generally expect that to be returned within a week of receiving it. Another question came up about whether when doing the debarment checks, do they need to have the owner name as well as the company name? And you did address that, and just re-emphasizing there that yes, you need to do both. This is related to the USDOL's new rule related to Davis-Bacon and related acts. I put in the chat, this was from the new rule October 21st, 2023, but it should say October 23rd, 2023. Someone asked, we hired an engineering firm to submit our CDBG grant. Can we pay their cost from the CDBG grant? And so that was replied to in the chat that no, there are no application costs that may be charged to the CDBG program funding. Another question was asked, can the fees for construction administration, post-construction, final bid documents, and bidding paid out, can that be paid with CDBG grant, or do they have to use their own funds? And the response there is in the chat. Generally, yes. Most of those costs can typically qualify as eligible CDBG costs and may be considered construction costs typically. However, you should contact your DECR project representative to verify specific items are eligible, and we would also look to see if any of them are subject to competitive procurement, and if so, were the competitive procurement processes followed. Things like, fees wouldn't be competitive procurement, but there are certain services that might be subject to that, in which case we'd need to verify, depending on how the contract was executed, whether it was with the local government or with the prime contractor. So there's different things to consider there. And so you just want to talk with your individual project rep. There was a question for a PF project, and this could be any CDBG project that has no acquisition or relocation, nor a sole benefit of owner situation. Does anything need to be sent to DECR? And the response there is no. No documentation needs to be provided. I'm going to come back to some of the things in the chat because we do have another question, and I can cover the ones that have already been responded to in the chat in a moment. So we have one other question here. If the construction start date cannot begin on or before July 1, 2025, is it still acceptable for submission of a pay application for the construction contractors purchase of or reimbursement of stored materials acceptable? I'll let you answer that, Joe. Did we lose you, Joe? You're on mute, Joe.
It would be helpful if I turned on the microphone. Yes, I believe that would be acceptable. They do need to ensure that everything has been properly procured, and I know Angela will correct me if I'm wrong here.
Well, just that if you don't start by July 1, you're in non-compliance. So keep that in mind.
Correct. Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
you wouldn't be
I
eligible
misread.
to get
I
paid.
misread
Yeah.
that as if construction hasn't started yet, but if the items have been purchased and are on site and it's not yet July 1st, they could certainly submit. Isn't that correct?
So once July 1 hits, you are considered in non-compliance. So you wouldn't be eligible for a payment until you're in compliance. Are those costs reimbursable? Yes, but you'd either be looking at prior to the construction start date or after the date you come into compliance. The goal is not to be in non-compliance.
Correct.
Oh, yeah, but they could, as you, Joe, I think you were going, I agree with your point of, well, if it's before they're in non-compliance, they could request the funds.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe
Yeah.
the materials coming in May or June.
Right, yeah. Yeah. So the answer is yes. The answer is no if it's after July 1 and you're in non-compliant status, but otherwise those costs are eligible. We have another question regarding the question above regarding construction admin, post-construction, final bid documents and bidding being paid for with CDBG funds. Wouldn't this potentially be considered engineering costs and thus only paid with match? And the answer to that is potentially, not all. So there are a number of things that aren't engineering costs, that aren't paid through an engineering contract and so could be reimbursed. But if these are all services, and that's where it's consulting with your individual DECA representative in terms of how they were paid. Craig Johnson's the one that asked this, and he's right in that if it's part of your engineering contract cost, then it cannot be used for, you cannot use CDBG funds to pay for it. With most of our programs, there are some exceptions for some other programs, but even then it has to be competitive. The engineer would have had to have been competitively procured then. But for most of our CDBG programs, we don't cover engineering costs. And therefore, if all of these costs listed were paid through your engineering contract, you couldn't use CDBG funds for them. So thank you for that question, because that's an important thing to consider.
It's also important to note if those services are being provided as part of the grant administration services. It may potentially be the same firm as the firm providing engineering services, but if it's for grant administration contract, those potentially could be paid for, if eligible, using CDBG dollars, but you'll need to refer back to your DOA DECA grant agreement as to whether or not in the initial budget setup, if those admin costs were factored in, and if you notified us that you'd be using part of your CDBG award to cover a portion of administrative costs.
Yes, correct. And again, if it's part of the engineering admin, if you don't have it as part of your grant agreement, you need an amendment to have any administrative costs paid with CDBG. There's a question that was in the chat that we responded to asking about where do they find wage determinations. And that link is posted, but it's also in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, or Chapter 7. So you can find them on the SAM website, the sam.gov website, the same one where you do debarment checks. There's also a location where you actually look for wage decisions.
They combined with what used to be WDOL.
Yeah, they put everything all in one place, which is kind of nice. Another question is, what needs to be included in the single audit statement due January 15th, 2025? At this point, it sounds like we may not have an executed grant agreement until November, December in calendar year 2024. So basically asking what would need to be reported, and that has been responded to in the chat. But basically, it's covered in Chapter 9, and also the single audit statement templates are provided for Chapter 9, and their attachments 9G and 9H, and those provide some guidance. But also, you are considering all federal funds expended by the local government in 2024. And there was a question, do they really have to report in 2025 if you're a new grantee? And that has been clarified. I think there was some misunderstanding with what Joe was talking about related to the end of your grant period. So every year you are reporting January 15th for the previous year. So you do for 2024 awardees, you're going to report your single audit statement is going to be due on January 15th, 2025. You'll have another one due January 15th, 2026, and another one due January 15th, 2027. So you do have it due anyone who's been awarded to date, and you're considering all federal funds, all expended, and there's more details related to thresholds and things like that as to whether you need to do a single audit report, which is the next step. So if you haven't met the threshold, which is $750,000 in federal funds, your single audit statement will say, we haven't met this threshold, so we don't have a single audit report due. If you have met the threshold, then you're going to report that you do have a single audit report due, and then your next step would be to do a report. But all that's detailed in Chapter 9. Another question was, what is the definition of substantial as it relates to substantial changes in your scope of work, and how that relates to the wage decisions and whether you have to get a new wage decision for your project in the contract? And that is listed in Chapter 9, Chapter 7, but also Ben put it in the chat. But they can refer to Chapter 9 to refer to what that particularly means. And you would, in any situation like that, you would contact your individual project representative to confirm that whatever you're doing is substantial. That also could impact environmental review, remember. So you'd refer to your project rep to see, is it substantial enough to change my environmental review? And is it substantial enough to change my wage decision? Let's see. Seeing if there's anything else new. I think we covered them all. There's a question about how they report work hours on the data report that's due at the end of the reporting period, when they have to collect the data from a contractor, and then they have to report the hours on the CDBG data report, and the CDBG data report is due on March 25th, whereas the reporting period doesn't end until March 31st. And the response we just confirmed is that you would report on the next reporting period. So that was already put in the chat. I think those are all the questions so far, Joe.
Okay.
And they were all answered in chat, but again, for the recording purposes, we've now shared them publicly as well.
Yes. Thank you so much. All right, well, we will stick around for a little bit longer if anyone does have questions and would like to submit them. Otherwise, you're certainly free to go. We greatly appreciate you attending today.